First of all, I have to say thank you. I have just got to say thank you to Chuck for inviting me to be here this morning with you, to this church for being here for us to come and celebrate and teach and learn and do all the things that we've done this weekend, to Michael for coordinating this conference, for Ron for his incredible work in getting us all together and making sure that we had enough coffee in our bodies yesterday. A small thing, but to some of us not a small thing at all. And to all of you. Oh my goodness, there I am. Okay. I'm not used to seeing myself. To all of you, everyone who's here, both in the congregation and on Zoom, for spending a few minutes to listen. I consider it an incredible privilege that I have people who will do that for me, who will sit still for a few moments and listen to what I have to say. Thank you so much. Now for the prayer for illumination. Feel free to join if you would like. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Amen. Pastor Lewis, I'm going to have to resist the temptation. Tell me if I get up and start walking around. I'm supposed to stay here, and I'm used to moving. Anyway, Pastor Lewis did as she had done every Sunday for the 10 or 12 years that she had been pastoring the church. She walked down the center aisle as the prelude started, slowly, and then as she moved toward the front, she went up the stairs and sat in the chair on the dais, and turned around and sat down and looked at the congregation, enjoying the faces of the people that had become friends and neighbors and all kinds of love shared among the congregation. She enjoyed it when she caught someone's eye and they could share a little smile across the sanctuary. It was a wonderful experience for her, except that this Sunday there seemed to be some unease in the congregation. She noticed people shifting about in their seats and mothers shoving their sons back in the pew. She didn't quite understand what it was all about until she saw it, or she saw her, or she saw him, or whatever. There in the third row, right in front, on the aisle, was a woman with striking blonde, platinum blonde hair, just a big do. And she looked carefully at the person, and for a second she was confused, and then she realized, I'm not sure this person is really a woman. I mean, she looks a lot like a man with a wig and makeup and a dress, and I don't know what to do with this person in the congregation. Clearly everyone was beginning to see her and didn't quite understand what was going on. And then the prelude ended, and Pastor Lewis got up like she had for Sundays before and said, "We want to welcome all." She got through the service okay. But when it was over, she went out the back and stood at the door to greet people as she left. And folks didn't say much about the things they were observing in the congregation that morning. One or two people said something cryptic about it, but she didn't. There was that person, that woman or man or whoever, in line to greet the pastor. And it was only a second before she was there, and she held out her hand warmly and said, "Hello, Pastor Lewis. Do you remember me?" And boy, talk about confusion then. Pastor Lewis was working at the edge of her expertise as a pastor, way out there on the edge, trying to figure out what was going on. And this person said, "My name is Raymond Bishop. You know me, my mother Betty. She was a member of this congregation for a long time, and we came here up until a couple of years ago when she died." Pastor Lewis did remember Betty. Betty was one of the really active members of the congregation. She could remember little Ray coming and standing by her side at church and at just about every meeting that she came to in the church. Ray seemed to be kind of devoted to the church just as much as his mom. And here was Raymond, dressed as a woman, in the congregation. Pastor Lewis really worked hard to get the words of welcome out of her mouth, and said that she thought and she hoped that Raymond would come back to church. She didn't say the words that were in her mind, "But not dressed like that, please." And she left. Raymond left. And we've learned the first lesson about what it is to be other. Little Ray, such a devoted part of that old congregation, had somehow, in a few moments' time, become other. Not us. Someone, maybe even something else. You don't know that I was actually reading that while I was talking. Okay, so we moved to a black screen. No, not you. I just pretend. We moved to a black screen, and on the screen it says 25 years earlier. 25 years from then. I was parked in my old 1974 Volvo in the old office parking lot in front of a sign that said, Presbytery of Greater Atlanta. It was May and the sun was baking, and my old Volvo didn't have any air conditioning anymore. And I started worrying about something that I had never worried about before in my life. I was worried about my makeup melting. It was strange, but many years before, when I was 10 and a little boy, I began to build this desire in my heart to grow up to be a woman. I wanted to be a girl. There I was, 10 years old, in suburban Atlanta, Georgia, my home, in 1956. So you have to picture Old South, Atlanta, 1956. Good little boy who suddenly realizes that he doesn't want to grow up to be a man. He wants to grow up like the girls in his class and become a woman. I have to admit, I'm a little bit on the smart side. You know, I'm not dumb. And so I didn't say anything to anybody about that at all. I was sure that if I had talked to my parents or the church or anyone, it would have changed the course of my life profoundly. And I did not want that. I loved my family. I loved my life. The only thing that I wanted to change was my gender. Well, at about the same time, my mom and dad started sending me and my two younger sisters off to the Presbyterian church down the street. It was about 2 blocks away, so they could safely kick us out the door at 9 o'clock on Sunday morning and say, we'll see you at church at 11. and have some time to themselves, which, you know, being a parent myself, I now understand how important that was. At the church, we learned a great lesson. I was so fortunate in the church that I went to. So many people like me belonged to churches that preached fear and obedience. And this was not a church like that at all. This was a Presbyterian church. I joke about why I'm a Presbyterian minister. The reason is because it was the closest church to our house. Simple. It's probably as good a reason as any, I think. And so this church taught that God is omniscient and omnipotent. I learned those big words at 10 years old. I knew those. I was proud of them. God knows and sees everything, and God is all-powerful. I learned those words, and I have to tell you, if they came by themselves, they would have terrified me. My little 10-year-old spirit that was suffering with this idea that I must have been broken because I had not heard any other little boy, anyone say anything about boys wanting to be girls. That just didn't exist in the world as far as I knew. I had created sin. But the part of the message that went along with omnipotent and omniscient was that God was all loving. That God loved me for who I am, who I will be. God loved me for everything that was in me, and God knows me deeply. And those messages resonated inside of me in a way that sustained me through terrible years of adolescence and into adulthood. Got me to church camp as a counselor, where I met a woman that I fell in love with. And for a few months, long enough to get married, I felt like she had cured me. But she hadn't. And the following March, on my birthday, I found myself dressed in my wife's clothes at home alone, completely devastated because I had now involved someone in my broken life who was deeply connected to me. I was so ashamed of myself that I could not talk to her about who I was. I should have, as soon as she came home, instead of being as depressed as I was, I should have said, Sigrid, I have something really important to tell you. I didn't. I was frightened. I was ashamed. I was deeply ashamed of who I was, of what I was. I vowed that I would never, ever tell her or anyone. I would die with that secret within me. I would not hurt anyone in the world with that reality. No reason. Wouldn't help me, wouldn't help anyone else, so why do it? And so I went on. I learned how to work really hard and play really hard and do everything to distract me from what was inside my heart. And it worked. It worked for, 25 years. Sigrid and I had 2 wonderful children. The younger was premature and as a result was severely disabled with cerebral palsy and moderate brain damage and moderate intellectual impairments. She used a power wheelchair to get around, and she was a wonderful excuse for my growing depression. I was a therapist. That's all the other. I went to seminary twice, got 2 degrees, became a psychotherapist, got ordained as a Presbyterian minister. I did a lot of things. I built a sailboat. I built a house. I found ways to distract myself that would make any normal person exhausted. And the problem for me was that the problem never went away. I could hide it as best I could, but it never went away. And I believe that the worst sin that I ever committed in my life against another person was allowing my family and my colleagues to believe that it was my beautiful, spirit-filled younger daughter. Michael knows her. That she in any way had anything to do with my depression, because she did not. But it was a convenient excuse. It got to be so bad, though, that by the time I reached my mid-40s, my wife, Sigrid, came and said, "I'm sorry, but as soon as our children leave home," and Laura was 19 and Inga was 23, she said, "I'm sorry, as soon as our children leave home, I'm gone too." And she didn't say she was leaving me, but I knew what she meant. She meant that our marriage was over, and I couldn't believe it. It was so hurtful to me that I just about came apart. I could not understand how in the world I would get through the future. I thought, well, maybe I'll be lucky enough to find another woman like her. And then do what? Involve another woman in this thing that I'm struggling with? Do it again? Keep secrets from her? And no, I don't want to do that. I won't do that. The solution seemed to be suicide. That's true for about 41% of people who are transgender or gender nonconforming. 41% of transgender people. 41%. That compares to 6% of the general population. 41% of transgender people consider suicide, and I did. I had a plan. The only problem was that daughter of mine who adored me, and I adored her. I could not imagine what it would do to her for me to kill myself. So I faced the one thing that I dreaded the most in life, the idea that I was going to have to do a gender transition. Believe me, it was not the big thing that my heart spoke of. I was not wanting to do that. But I knew in my heart that the only way forward was to do that. And this day that I was sitting alone in my Volvo in front of the Presbytery office, I was getting ready to go in and for the first time confront the Presbyterian church, because I was dressed in a beautiful skirt suit with 2-inch heels. I had a sheer blouse with a camisole under it so you could sort of see through it. It was very, very tasteful and very feminine. And there I was, ready to do that, and I was terrified. My life was going to change. I had been a member of the Presbytery for 23 years, and I felt like in those moments I was becoming another. I moved from being a part of the Presbytery to being other, and I stayed that way for almost 1.5 years from that moment. Other, not us, not our people, not the people that we know and are comfortable with. Other people, people who are different colors, speak different languages, wear different clothes, eat different food, believe different things, have different names for God. Those are others. And I became one of those. Flag across the screen again. 2,500 years earlier. We're in Jerusalem. We're in Jerusalem where things are on the upswing. They had had a really rough time. Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians had conquered Israel and destroyed Jerusalem. I went back when I wrote about that and I said, I need to look. It's Kharkiv is the city that was so devastated in the bombing by the Russians. Kharkiv was literally decimated, just reduced to a pile of rubble. And we don't have pictures. We didn't have video. There was no CNN 2,500 years ago. But I am certain within my heart that Jerusalem probably did not look very much different than that. The temple that David had built, this sacred place of worship and prayer, had been destroyed, leveled to the ground. But now, and by the way, all the leaders, people like you, the community leaders, the religious leaders in the community, the political leaders, all of those people had been carried off by the Babylonians into captivity. They didn't take all the Jews. I mean, that's kind of unrealistic because there were a lot of them, and we kept saying, this mass exodus. No, they took the people who were important. They took the ones who were most likely to organize the people and bring them back to a place where they could resist and move forward. They were smart. Nebuchadnezzar was not a dummy. He took those folks out of there and he carried them back to Babylon. And over 70 years, that's the traditional time. It was probably more than 70 years. In those times, it was several generations. The Jews lived in captivity. And of course, as they did that, they adopted Babylonian cultural things. They dressed like the Babylonians. They ate like the Babylonians. They still worshiped God. They continued the worship of God together on their Sabbath. But in terms of everything else, they kind of looked like Babylonians. In fact, some of them had become eunuchs. Some of them had their, I can say this because this is an R-rated audience, they had their male genitalia was removed so that they could not impregnate women, so they couldn't raise an army, so they couldn't do the things that would threaten Nebuchadnezzar. Now, I know you remember your Jewish history from Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. Genesis, Exodus, okay, whatever. The Deuteronomic code that the Jews had gotten was clear, that the people who prayed in the Holy of Holies were only to be males who were perfect. They had to be males who were perfectly fertile and capable of procreating. The animals that were slaughtered for sacrifices were only to be perfect males. You can't pick a sick sheep from your flock and bring that to be sacrificed. You have to pick your finest. What is a male sheep? A ram, right? You have your finest ram, and see, I'm 75 years old. See, you have your finest ram. So, what's happening here in Jerusalem 2,500 years ago is they're rebuilding the temple. You could sort of see walls going up and people bringing food to the workers. People rejoicing that the temple is being rebuilt. And the discussion among the leaders was this: who can we admit to worship? Who can come and worship in the new temple? According to our laws, people who were foreigners, wearing funny dress, speaking funny languages, and eating funny food, were not really welcome in the temple. And especially those eunuchs. Those ones who were not, they were as far away from open to being welcome in God's place as anyone. others. Others. People who weren't us. They had been us. As you notice, my three stories have a thread in common. It always moves from someone who had been part of us to someone who had now been rejected. And so it sounded really familiar. I used to preach it a lot back before 2011 because it preached. It preached very well because we were not letting LGBTQ plus people into the places of ministry in our church or into enjoying marriage in our places of worship. So it was really today. It has more of a political quality to it because of our political struggle now as transgender people to maintain our right to compete in sports and to maintain our right to parent our transgender children. Back to the present. Flash from 2,500 years ago, as the Israelites are trying to figure out who gets into the temple. Dee, a person I met just yesterday, told me about, I think she said it in her thing, but we talked about it later. She had the wonderful experience of opening up her new passport. How many people have passports? Yeah, it's it's a good thing to have. You never know, when the president is going to call you up and say, I need you to go to Saudi Arabia to speak for us, I'm waiting. Anyway, she opened up her new passport and she opened it to that page, with all the identifying stuff, date of birth and name and picture and all that stuff. And there was the gender designator down there, which had always been either M for male or F for female. And she had on her gender designator X. X, which officially meant gender nonconforming or outside the gender binary people who didn't fit into M or F categories. They didn't say that, they said X. It said X. And I think of X as another way of saying other. I'm glad that Dee was delighted that she got to do that she got that done and had success in it. I would have preferred that they had taken out gender and sex designators altogether. I don't see the need for them. There's absolutely nothing about them that identifies anyone definitively in any way. I think we can just do without them. So, if I were in her position, that's what I would be lobbying for, is getting rid of it. But she did it, and she got an X, and she was delighted. There was a little part of me that hurt, though, because of her joy in that. Because X seems so much like other. People who can't write sign their signatures with an X. Ooh, we're after. How long have I been preaching? Way too long. Okay. Dee and her new passport made me realize that othering is not binary. It's not just an either nor, us and them, but we can other people in degrees. And Dee, who was one of our wonderful presenters yesterday, she was great. They were great. Excuse me, pronouns. Dee was just wonderful, but and she told us about her passport thing, but it wasn't a complete victory. It was partial, because she still didn't belong to us. The us are M's or F's. We're an M or an F, and we're us. That's us, M or F, and X are others. So, what do we learn from this morning? Our words in Isaiah came from precisely that time in history when the temple was being rebuilt. It was precisely about the argument at the time. Who can come to church? Who belongs here? And the words are clear. They are crystal clear. My house is a house of prayer for all people. For all people. Let the children come to me. Let them come to me so that I can touch them. Children in ancient Israel had been others with a capital O. Children were not they weren't acceptable in the temple at all. We didn't have multi-generational learning in the temple. Children were to be kept out of sight until they became adults. And they were the big others. So Jesus ended his saying in the gospel this morning by telling us that the children, even the children are welcome. Let the eunuch not say, I'm a dry tree. God said, for I will give to them in my house a name and place better than the gendered names of sons and daughters. I think we're still waiting for that name. I'm hoping it comes soon. Think of Jesus. Think of how Jesus performed his ministry. His work was among those people who were others, the outcast, women. Jesus befriended women in ways that men were never even allowed to do. The poor. Jesus identified with the poor. He understood them. He believed in them. He believed in their power. The unclean. Probably one of the biggest taboo in Jewish society was to touch anyone who was considered to be unclean. And that has to do with both ritually unclean and physically unclean. And one of the most unclean was a woman in her period. Oppressors. Jesus even identified with those who were oppressing. You know, those of us here at this church can make others of the people in the House and Senate and say those people don't really understand what's going on. You know, they don't belong to us. We are the people who really knows what's going on. Jesus understood them. He believed and taught them. He treated them as individuals, as people who had real lives, people who had families and love. And remember the centurion whose friend was dying and sent for Jesus to come and cure him. And the centurion got kind of cold feet and said, oh, no, you know, I understand you can't come in here because of the way you believe. And Jesus said, nothing doing. And he was there. The oppressed. And especially racial enemies. Jesus, you know, the story of the Good Samaritan is one of the most popular biblical stories in the world. And we don't often pay much attention to it, but it's a story of racial friendship and connection. It's a story of how Jesus wanting to teach us how important it was to believe that people of different races can be our brothers and sisters and not other. So, the title to my sermon is called The Other Others. I know you've been looking up there and wondering, what the heck am I talking about? We know about these others, and I think all of us probably, I know for me, at one time or another, I've always thought of them as others in my life, maybe in a weak moment. It's easy for me to put them off. And then when I think about it very hard, I remember that I have been us before. I'm not quite as much an other these days, but I'm still pretty other according to a lot of Presbyterians. I think all of us know what it is to be other. I think each human being, if we live very long, have that privilege to live our lives in connection with other people, know that there's something about us that just really doesn't quite fit in. I don't know what it is. It might have been something that happened when you were in college. It might have been the way an uncle treated you when you were a little girl. It might have been anything that could have happened to you that made you question who you are and what you were about. So the others in this whole story aren't just about Raymond in the church. That was a real story, by the way, from my childhood church growing up in, it was the Ebenezer United, no, it is now the Ebenezer United Church of Christ. When I was growing up, it was the Ebenezer Evangelical and Reformed Church, very old. That story came from there. We belong to all these folks. When we other folks, we're always pointing at ourselves. We're always afraid of something inside of us that someone might find out. And what Jesus says to us is, yes, you're one of the others, and you belong to me. You belong to me just like I learned at Mount Vernon Presbyterian Church at the age of 10 that I belong to God, no matter where I went or what I did. I'd like to end with a prayer, if you'll bear with me for another minute, by Thomas Merton. Let us pray. My Lord God, I have no idea where I am going. I do not see the road ahead of me. I cannot know for certain where it will end. Nor do I really know myself. And in fact, that I think I am following your will does not mean that I'm actually doing so. But I believe that the desire to please you does, in fact, please you. And I hope I have that desire in all that I'm doing. I hope I will never do anything apart from that desire. And I know that if I do this, you will lead me by the right road, though I may know nothing about it. Therefore, I will trust you always, though I may seem to be lost and in the shadow of death. I will not fear, for you are ever with me, and you will never leave me to face my perils alone. Amen.